Okay, good evening, everyone. I hope you had a wonderful Yom Tov. I do want to go backwards a little bit to talk about the Chumash that we are in, rather than a particular Parsha. That is, we are in the fourth book of the Torah, and normally that book is called Bamidbar, but it's interesting that Chazal call it Chumash HaPikudim, which literally means the Chumash of census, which actually corresponds to the English term numbers. So numbers is actually the rabbinic term for the book of Bamidbar. And the reason is because the book of Numbers is bracketed by two, I don't know if the word is censuses or censi, whatever the Latin plural would be. In the beginning of the book of Bamidbar, we have a census of the Jews, actually not all the Jews, but the males from 20 and up, who left Egypt. That's the old generation. And at the end of the book of Bamidbar, we have another census after the generation of the spies had died out, which represent the new generation that is going to enter the land of Israel. So the book of Numbers is bracketed by two countings of the Jewish people that are approximately 40 years apart. The first counting is the Yotzei Mitzrayim, the Jews who left Egypt. The second counting are the Ba'ei Haaretz, the Jews that will be entering the land of Israel. It is a totally different population base, because in the first counting you had to be 20 at the time of the Exodus. In the second counting you specifically were not 20 at the time of the Exodus, because that generation died out. What is interesting is that the sum total of the population is the same in both counts, although the tribes and the clans within the tribes change numbers. So if you looked at the various numbers, you will see some tribes grew in population, some tribes lost population, but B'sach HaKol, it's an amazing thing, the number remains the same at the 603,000 point. We are not going to be talking about the second census today. We're going to talk about the first census. And what is interesting, as Rashi points out, is that this first census, the Torah tells us, occurred Rosh Chodesh Iyar, the beginning of the second year of the Exodus. This is 1 month after the Mishkan was dedicated. The Mishkan was completed and dedicated Rosh Chodesh Nisan. 1 month later, the Jewish people are counted. Now Rashi points out a very interesting thing, that this is not the first census of even that generation. They in fact were counted a mere 6 months earlier, in the aftermath of the golden calf, meaning after the golden calf, Moshe prayed for the Jewish people. God forgave the sin on Yom Kippur. That is why Yom Kippur became the Day of Atonement. And the day after Yom Kippur, we begin building a Mishkan, and people gave various contributions. So you may recall that one of the contributions was a half shekel of silver that was melted down and used for the sockets of the Mishkan. And if you count the half shekels, you will see once again, right, because the Torah records the total of the half shekels, you will see a population of 603,000. So Rashi makes the point that the generation that left Egypt was counted twice. They were counted after Yom Kippur, in the aftermath of the Chet HaEgel, and then they were counted 6 months later, Rosh Chodesh Iyar, after the Mishkan was built. So there are two questions that Rashi raises about this counting. Question number one is, why would they need to be counted within a span of 6 months? What would the purpose be? They were counted after Yom Kippur. Why would they be counted after Hakamat HaMishkan, Rosh Chodesh Iyar? What is the purpose of repetitive countings? With respect to that question, Rashi answers that the concept of God commanding the Jewish people to be counted and recounted and recounted is simply an expression of divine love. The same way that a miser might continuously count his gold and silver again and again and again, although the miser certainly knows how much he has. So God knows how many Jews there are, but God wants us to be counted. This is an expression of chiba, an expression of love and affection. We will come back to Rashi's comments and perhaps explore a deeper meaning. But then Rashi raises a second question that's very interesting. Who is included in the census? Anybody that reached their 20th birthday. Meaning if you're younger than 20, you're not included. Didn't anybody have a birthday between Yom Kippur and Iyar? Because the populations are the same in the two countings. But if anybody became 20 in between, they would be added to the second counting. Now, what are you going to say? You might want to answer, well, maybe yes, maybe new people were added, but maybe some people died. So maybe we have a coincidence that there was no net population growth because whichever numbers were added were also diminished by death. But that's not a good answer because we have a tradition that there are no natural deaths in the Midbar other than the many deaths that are recorded in the Torah. The Torah, of course, records many deaths, including the death of the whole generation, eventually. But other than the specific deaths that occurred, that the Torah enumerates, there were no other natural deaths. Now, in point of fact, between Yom Kippur and the Hakamas HaMishkan, the Torah records only 2 people dying. That is Nadav and Avihu, the sons of Aaron. Those are the only ones. So therefore, clearly, no one else died, and yet if the two populations are the same, how could that be? Wasn't anybody born between Yom Kippur and Iyar, which should make the second population more? So because of this, Rashi has a very, very interesting chiddush. Rashi actually says that the halachic definition of birthday for purposes of census taking did not refer to when you were born. Rather, every Rosh Hashanah, everybody became 1 year older. So even if you were born 1 month before Rosh Hashanah, when Rosh Hashanah came, you were 1. By the way, I believe that racehorses are aged that way. When you say a racehorse is 3 years old or whatever. Therefore, Rashi points out, between Yom Kippur and Iyar, there is no Rosh Hashanah. So anybody who was 20 on Yom Kippur became 20 that Rosh Hashanah, and nobody else became 20 over the next 6 months. Even if you had your birthday later in the year, you would not be 1 year older until Rosh Hashanah. Now, number one, this is unusual, because normally the Torah would not use a uniform birth date for all children. Number two, if it would use a uniform birth date, it's more likely it would be Nisan. Nisan always changes the years, not Tishrei, but Nisan wouldn't work, because between Yom Kippur and Iyar, there is a Nisan, so Rashi is forced to look at Rosh Hashanah. But okay. So be it as it may, so these are the two questions that Rashi addresses. Number one, why are there two countings? And number two, why is there no change? But I want to focus on a different aspect, and that is, the counting after Yom Kippur is actually a very different type of counting than the counting after Hakamas HaMishkan and Iyar. The counting after Yom Kippur is a very anonymous counting. People simply dropped their half shekels in a pushka, and Moshe and Aaron counted the half shekels and figured out how many men age 20 and up there must have been. But we don't know how many Reuvens, how many Shimons, how many Yehudas. There was no tribal breakdown. It was an anonymous, collective, communal counting without according any significance to individual tribes. By contrast, the counting after Hakamat HaMishkan was not just a counting collectively of how many Jews there were, it was a tribal breakdown of Reuven, Shimon. Levi was not counted in that census, but they were counted separately, so we know how many Leviim. The difference is, you'll recall, that Leviim were counted from 30 days old, as opposed to 20, but we still have a sense of every Shevet. Not only in the second counting do we have a sense of Shevet, but we also have a sense of individual. The Ramban says an amazing thing. When the Torah describes the census, the Torah uses the words b'mispar shemos, which could be translated the counting of the names. But the Ramban says the word mispar or lisaper, right, it's the same letters. Lispor is to count. Lisaper, same letters, is to narrate. And the Ramban translates the words Mispar Shemot means the narration of names. Meaning, you didn't put your money in a pushka that Moshe counted. You yourself as an individual had to physically hand your money to Moshe Rabbeinu, or your shekel, your half shekel. By the way, a half shekel, don't confuse it with an Israeli half shekel. The half shekel there was quite a sizable contribution. It would be equivalent perhaps to $10 or $20 today. But be it as it may, you gave it to Moshe yourself, because the Ramban says it was very important that at least one time in your life you actually got to meet Moshe Rabbeinu and he got to know who you were. Very amazing. Now today, people go to different Gedolim and Bnei Brak or Chaim Kanievsky, and you can imagine they're given I was going to say 1 minute, but that's much more than they get. They're given 10 seconds and then somebody pushes them away. Imagine how many people ever got to talk to Moshe Rabbeinu. Through no fault of his own, he was not the most approachable person. Because, number one, he was very busy. He was talking to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. He was running a nation of 3 million people, taking us through the desert after Yetzias Mitzrayim. If you had a mix-up with your fleishik spoon and milchik bowl, you wouldn't go to Moshe Rabbeinu to ask him the shaila. Okay? Yeah, no. Yeah. You'd find somebody else to ask. In fact, the Gemara tells us that Aaron was more beloved to the average Jew than was Moshe, simply because Aaron was involved in family disputes. Aaron was involved in one-to-one. Moshe Rabbeinu was not. That was not his avodah. Moshe Rabbeinu represented the whole nation of Am Yisrael in their relationship with God. But the Ramban says, even the manhig, who represents the entire Jewish nation, must also have a sense of every individual. As they say in Yiddish, even if you're involved in Klal Yisrael, you also have to be connected to Reb Yisrael, the individual Jew. So the Ramban says, every person should have an opportunity once in their life to personally connect to Moshe Rabbeinu, even in a very, very brief way. But remember, this was the second counting. So the point I'm making is, the first counting was anonymous and collective. We counted how much money there was, we knew how many people there were. The second counting is, number one, tribally based, and number two, even and to some degree, individually focused. So it's not quite true to say that the two countings are simply repetitive. There's a significant difference in how the population was assessed and evaluated. And there's a very significant lesson in all of this. And that is, it's really an issue that we face in the Jewish world, and it's an issue that the world faces in the world community. And that is, how do you create communities which are cohesive, that share values, that work towards common goals, when everybody's different? Everybody has their own culture. Everybody has their own priorities. Everybody has their own needs. How do you create communities as opposed to a wild state of nature in which each person is simply looking after their selfish self-interest? And in truth, there have been two models that nations have used, both of which are deficient. One might be called the melting pot model. The melting pot model, again, I'm more familiar with the United States, but of course this has been utilized in Israel with sometimes tragic results. The melting pot idea is, you want to form a nation, we have to get rid of idiosyncrasies, we have to get rid of individualism, we have to get rid of cultural connections to prior environments. And we want people to be the same, to merge to destroy your old identities by merging into something new. If you take the United States, let's say, the early 20th century, there was no concept. If somebody would have brought up in an educational system to give classes in Spanish, in other words, that would be something you'd laugh at. You come to the United States, you learn English. That's the whole point. Of course, melting pots means assimilation. Melting pot means giving up your distinctiveness in the interest of a greater cause. Lately, in Israel, of course, if you think about incidents like Yeldei Teiman, whatever it is, various kids who came from religious backgrounds, who were forcibly put in non-religious environments in order to be acculturated to what was regarded then as the overall goals of Israeli society in the early years of the state. In fact, to some degree, I don't want to get into all of that history, a lot of the anti-Zionism, sometimes the unreasonable and unfair anti-Zionism of the Haredi world, the ultra-Orthodox, is really a legacy from negative historical encounters that go back to the 1940s and even earlier. In a sense, people are fighting yesterday's battles, which is always a problem, but that bitterness still lingers to this very day. The notion of forcible melting pot. A melting pot, in other words, is the model of obliteration of uniqueness and individuality in favor of fostering a cohesive, integrated whole. It resembles, in a pejorative way, how a cholent might look the Wednesday following the Shabbos that it was made, right? So you made a nice cholent. So on Friday, you had meat and potatoes and barley and beans, all sorts of good, nice, distinct ingredients. But by Wednesday of the next week, and I hope it doesn't last that long, but if by Wednesday of the last week, it looks like an indistinguishable glop in which the meat, the potatoes, and the barley all become one thing. That is the notion of melting pot. Now, the opposite model is multiculturalism. Multiculturalism, run amok, actually means we are so interested in fostering individuality and celebrating diversity that you literally don't have a nation anymore because everybody creates their own subgroup, their own way of doing things. This is the major problem that Europe certainly faces with the influx of how to deal with Islamic fundamentalism. Europe is, as we all know, is falling apart. The United States is not quite there yet, but who knows what's going to happen. Part of why someone like Trump gets elected is to perhaps put a lid on the spread of multiculturalism run amok. But multiculturalism basically says that the most important thing is your group, your agenda, your singular identity, even at the expense of the cohesiveness and unity of some type of national vision. To put it another way, there are two visions of creating a community. One is melting pot, and one we might call, instead of multiculturalism, we might call the salad bowl. Melting pot focuses on obliteration of distinctions. A salad bowl understands that the greatest and most beautiful community is when you combine different colors, right? What is nice about a salad? Different colors, different textures, different tastes. It is the beauty of the differences that mold and create a harmony, which is a whole that is greater than the sum of the parts. One is an obliteration of uniqueness, and the other is a celebration of uniqueness and identity and individuality within a context of a harmonious blending. Again, it's very difficult to do. In a sense, it might be easier to create a single nation with conformity and sameness, but there is this alternative model. So I would suggest to you that the Torah itself is meramez to these two different types of unities in the two different ways the Jewish people are counted. And that is, the aftermath of the Cheder Egel was really a state of national emergency. Remember that God wanted to destroy the Jewish people. God wanted to obliterate the covenant that he made with Am Yisrael and make a private deal with Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe Rabbeinu turned it down. Moshe Rabbeinu said that if you're not going to have a covenant with Am Yisrael, erase me from your book. But we don't realize, or we should realize, how close we were to utter destruction. In a state of emergency, that is not a time to focus on your individuality. That is not a time to march to your own drummer. Like the aftermath of the Holocaust, there was an imperative to rebuild Jewish communities, rebuild yeshivot, even marriages. People, if you're familiar with you have family who survived the Holocaust, the marriages after the Holocaust were not romantic Hollywood marriages based on love. Baruch Hashem, they lasted, which is a very interesting point. But the basic idea was, we have to get married to keep the Jewish people alive and rebuild our lives. So if somebody looks suitable, go for it. Because focusing on yourself as an individual at a time of catastrophe and a time of calamity, it is egotistical and self-centered. So the Torah says, you're right, in the aftermath of the Ched HaHegel, we're not going to focus on Reuven's and Shimon's and individuals. Collectively, Am Yisrael has to do tshuva, has to turn to God, has to rebuild that relationship. And that is why the first census is anonymous and collective, because in the short run, that is the necessity that you must confront when you're rebuilding from calamity. But the Torah is then telling me, while that may be a short-term necessity, that is not the ultimate type of achdut that we're trying to create. The ultimate type of achdut, as you recover from that conformity, or from that calamity, is not going to be an achdut based on conformity and sameness. It will be an achdut that celebrates and validates and legitimates the differences that every person brings. As the Medrash tells us, you can use a lot of metaphors, whether you want to use the gastronomic metaphor of a salad bowl, or you want to talk about a tapestry, the beauty of a tapestry is in the different colors, or a garden. The Medrash tells us the beauty of a garden is when the flowers are different colors, not when they're all the same. A garden of only one type of rose may be pretty on some level, but it's not as beautiful as different colors. A symphony's beauty are when the different notes harmonize and come together. If you were to simply play the same note over and over and over again, it would not really be beautiful. Although there are some schools of atonal music that do that type of stuff, but that would not really be beautiful to the normal ear, at least. And therefore the Torah is merames that achdut needs to progress beyond the melting pot to embrace the salad bowl. And that is why in the second census, which represents the permanent relationship that God has with the Jewish people, Hakamat HaMishkan, Hashra'at HaShchina, the resting of the divine presence, we see an emphasis on tribes. Now, the Torah makes a very big deal about tribal origins. Every tribe had its own land in Eretz Yisrael. Every tribe had its own nasi, its own head of a tribe. In the Midbar, they had their own configurations, their own flag. And at first glance, you might wonder, why? Now again, today we don't really have a sense of tribes. Number one, most of us don't know our tribe. And other than Cohen and Levi, we don't even talk about it. But you see that in the Torah and in Tanakh, a tribe was important. It was like your nation. Your nation was not only the Jewish people. Your nation was. You were a Reuven. In fact, the Ramban even says, it's so fascinating, that in a commentary of the Ramban, he discusses that some of the issues the Jews faced were remarkably similar to the issues that the North and the South faced in the American Civil War. For example, if you remember in the book of Shoftim, There was a very, very sad and tragic story about a man who was traveling, and he brought his concubine with him to the territory of Binyamin, and the woman was raped and died. And what he then did, I mean, his reaction is equally heinous. He then took her body, he cut her up into 12 pieces, and he mailed, however it was delivered, I don't know what the Federal Express or whatever, UPS, he mailed a piece of her body to each tribe, demanding that they exact justice for this crime. And if you remember, the Binyaminites refused to deliver the wrongdoer, and as a result, the tribes declared a civil war against Binyamin, almost annihilating the entire tribe. This is a story at the end of the book of Judges, and it ends just with kind of a sarcastic remark. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Each person did whatever they thought was right in their eyes. As if to tell you, this was a lawlessness and an anarchy. But the Ramban has an amazing comment. The Ramban's comment was, why did Binyamin refuse to deliver the wrongdoer? The Ramban says, because each tribe regarded themselves as a separate sovereign state, and therefore they said, one tribe has no right to judge offenses that were committed in the territory of another tribe. Right? If somebody murders, right? If somebody murders in Venezuela, even if it's an American citizen, the U.S. doesn't have the right for care. Extradition is always the other way around. You can file for extradition to bring the person back to where they committed the crime. So the Ramban actually says that tribal consciousness was so great that they literally regarded themselves as sovereign countries. And part of why we needed a melech, similar to the United States forming a nation, is to create a central government as opposed to sovereign states. In fact, that's why, let's say in America, that's why the word state in international law normally refers to a sovereign nation called states, right? They're member states. So why would the individual states of the United States be called states? They ought to be called provinces, like in Canada. The answer is that is a remnant from a time where indeed the states were kind of sovereign states. So the point I'm making is tribes are a big deal. But one might wonder, why does God make tribes a big deal? Isn't there enough disunity in the Jewish people already that we have to have something else to fight over? I'm a Reuben, you're a Shimon, who's better? Why have tribes? We are Jews. Isn't that all that matters? But the answer is, maybe that's not all that matters. Because the concept of tribal affiliation means that God is saying, I don't want you to serve me as a single collectivity. Rather, each tribe had its own unique way of serving God. Each tribe had its own mission. Yisachar, for example, was the tribe who excelled in full-time learning of Torah. Zebulun was a supporter of Yisachar. We're not fully familiar with all of the nuances, but the concept of tribes is exactly the concept of the salad bowl rather than the melting pot, in which diversity is not a contradiction to community. Or to put it another way, community does not mean, and it does not have to mean, sameness and conformity. And therefore Shvatim become a big deal, and not only Shvatim, but as the Ramban pointed out, individuality, where I give my own coin and Moshe sees me as an individual. So basically, the two countings within the span of 7 months represent the fundamental idea that the higher level of unity is achieved not by obliterating differences, but recognizing that it is through the different perceptions that we have that we create a beauty and a wholeness that is greater than the sum of the individual parts, and that is what true Achdus is. Now, one has to understand that even this has certain limits, because the notion of what you might call Jewish multiculturalism does not necessarily consider every single idea compatible or consistent. I mean, there are many movements and people who, let's say, deny the divine authorship of the Torah, or who openly want to abrogate. Now, even then, we can treat people with respect. For example, I could take the position that somebody is theologically totally wrong and incorrect, but I can respect that they are searching for the truth, and I could at least consider them to have integrity. But certain ideas are not going to be equally legitimate. But within the Torah camp, those who subscribe to the belief in the Torah, we have to understand that there are many nuances, many ideas. For example, if you have, let's say, Haredi, Judaism, and you have Dati Leumi and different types of variations, sometimes you get the impression, living in Israel, where differences are accentuated and differences are very sharp, that these are two different religions. Two different religions, Dati Leumi, Haredi, never the twain shall meet. How many rabbis, will teach different students of different groupings? Very few. You can actually count them on the fingers of half a hand, not even a whole hand. Maybe literally 2 or 3 people that actually are your wives. Actually, I only know of one, but I'm assuming charitably there would be at least 3 or 4, and the like. And yet, what did I see? I wish I could remember this. I saw on the internet a bit of a parody of how we are so divided into groups that are virtually indistinguishable to the naked eye. They say that Eskimos have 300 words for different types of snow and ice, because they have to be so sensitive to the different types of snows that they can see colors and textures in the whiteness of snow that we wouldn't even be able to figure out at all. In Eretz Yisrael, we have an eye for religious differences that is so subtle that the average religious Jew, and certainly the non-religious Jew, won't even be able to know what are the differences here, and the like. So I saw something on the internet, it was a bit of a parody about a man who wanted to commit suicide. He was going to jump off the Gesher HaMeitarim. He was going to jump off the bridge there. And another Jew walks by and says, "Stop, stop, stop! Please don't do that, don't jump." He says, "Are you a Jew?" He says, "Yes, I'm a Jew." "Baruch Hashem, I'm a Jew also. Let's try to be friends." He says, again, in a lot of steps here, he says, "Are you a Chesed or a Misnageh?" He says, "I'm a Misnageh." "Baruch Hashem, so am I." He says, "Are you Mir or Chevron or Panovich?" He says, "I'm Mir." "Oh, so am I." He says, "Are you a Brisker in terms of ideology, or are you a Slobodka?" So he went through a lot of steps. I can't reproduce it. The person finally said, "I'm a Slobodka." He says, "Go jump." It's not worth it. You're so different than me. You're not my type of Jew anymore. Like those types of distinctions and the like. And yet the Torah is telling us that the achdus and strength of Am Yisrael comes from the different types of beauty and individuality that people bring to the mix. And we have to know, when we raise our children, sometimes there's a lot of pressure in all school systems to have a one-size-fits-all, in which a person is validated, a person is part of the community, only if they simply behave the way everybody else behaves. That's very destructive. Number one, the community itself loses from that. And kal v'chomer, the individual becomes stymied. The individual becomes repressed. The beauty that is within them never gets revealed, because they were forced to be someone and something that they're not. We have a phenomenon in Orthodoxy that's enormously disturbing and enormously complicated. The phenomenon that's called kids at risk or off the derech, OTD. And this is a very, very complicated phenomenon. There's certainly not a single cause. Absolutely, there is not a single cause. There may be many, many different reasons, and sometimes there is no reason we can even identify. Things happen. People make choices. But at least part of the problem, and again, I'm not suggesting it's the only problem, the only part of the problem, but part of the problem is that when children, adolescents, whatever the age, don't have an opportunity to develop the particular talents that they have, when their questions are not treated with respect because they're not the standard types of questions that are considered to be acceptable, and they feel that who they are has no place within the religious Jewish community, then they will look elsewhere for acceptance and validation. Most of the time, the places they go will not give them what they want. That happens to be the case. In fact, it'll be worse off than where they came from. But still, understandably, if I am who I am, and that's not appreciated, that's not considered to be good, that's not considered to be acceptable, but that's who I am, I will look elsewhere for some type of approval and some type of validation. So paradoxically, by circling the wagons and demanding conformity in the hope that that will protect your community, you may actually be engaged in a process of destroying the community. And the truth of the matter is, one has to know that it's not just kids at risk. There's a whole phenomenon of adults. And even if somebody is not at risk, they're doing mitzvot, they're going through the motions. But for many people, there's a certain deadness inside, a spiritual deadness. In other words, they might be well behaved enough that they will do whatever they're supposed to be doing. But there's no longer an enthusiasm. There's no longer a joy. There's no longer a passion. A person could be a religious Jew and be spiritually dead inside. The walking dead. That's why people who are in Jewish outreach, I know the phrase is kiruv rechokim, to bring near those who are far. But many people have said we need a tremendous effort for kiruv krovim, those who are ostensibly near. They're doing mitzvot, they're in the right shows, the right yeshivot, but they no longer have a relationship to God. And this tragically comes when people's individuality is not enabled to be developed. You know, there's a board, I mentioned this weeks ago, I'll mention it again because it connects here, a board from Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, and I sometimes get in trouble for mentioning it, so I always have to emphasize it is Rav Hirsch's board, it is not my thoughts. So if you don't like it, you blame Rav Hirsch. And it says by Yaakov and Esav that Yitzchak and Rivka had twins. Vayigdelu hana'arim, and the young boys grew up, and Esav became a wild hunter, and Yaakov became the dweller of tents, the one who studied Torah, the one who served God. How did it happen that two boys who were twins, from such great holy parents, one became a Rasha and one remained a tzaddik? So Rav Hirsch locates the problem in the very beginning of the verse. The youths grew up. He said, Yitzchak and Rivka gave Yaakov and Esav the identical chinuch. They raised them the same. They put both of them in whatever the Beis HaMedrash meant and said, your job is to learn 14 hours a day. Rav Hirsch said Esav needed a different type of education. Esav needed, now the mashal is my mashal, Esav needed to run around and play basketball. Esav too had talents. You know, high energy person, good organizer, get things done. And Esav's talents could have been developed in a positive and constructive vein. But when you try to take a personality of Esav and try to make him a Yaakov, not only will you not get a Yaakov, but the person who could have been righteous in his way will become a Rasha. Now, some people, I say, are critical of this thought because who gives us the right to criticize the parenting styles of the Avos? But I would just say, okay, If you don't want to apply it to that particular case, the overall thought is 100% valid. And indeed, this is exactly what Shlomo HaMelech said, the wisest of all people, in one of the most famous psukim in Tanakh, Chanoch Lenar al pi darko. You must train a child according to his way. And actually, it's interesting. The pasuk can have several meanings, but the Vilna Gaon's explanation is so well known that people just say that's exactly what the pasuk means. And the Vilna Gaon's well-known interpretation, that's so well known that people don't know it's from the Vilna Gaon, is that every child has their own unique personality. And chinuch is not about forcing that child into a different mold, but tapping into that personality so it becomes the person that person is able to become. You know, it's very interesting that the Maharal of Prague, it is said, had a grandson who did not seem to be able to learn Gemara. Maybe today we would say there was a learning disability. In those years, learning disabilities were not diagnosed or recognized. But the kid just couldn't get Gemara. But he had a different talent. He was unusually gifted with his hands. He could make things. He became a silversmith, he became a craftsman, and he could make things with his hands. He had what you might call a spatial intelligence. It's a different type of intelligence, the ability to visualize three-dimensional shapes. So the Maharal had him make scale models of the Mishkan, of the Beis HaMikdash, of the different models and halachic issues that arose. And by the way, these are things that even people, the other way around, people who might be very gifted in Gemara, when they come to things that require spatial intelligence, might be challenged because they can't visualize those things. And as a result of the Maharal enabling the child or the young man to explore things with his hands, the person wound up learning large parts of Torah that he otherwise wouldn't have known. You see? Because you capitalize on a person's strengths instead of squelching them and emphasizing other things. Similarly, psychologists tell us there are many types of intelligence. There is something called emotional intelligence. Sometimes you can have even a young child who's actually, we don't call it gifted, but who's extraordinarily empathetic, can sense what people are feeling, is able to respond, diffuse tensions, right? And that is a gift too. It's a gift that's not always appreciated. There's no award in school for that. There's no grade for that. But those are tremendous gifts. You build up those gifts. You give a person strength. Then Klal Yisrael, the individual, of course, becomes self-actualized, to use a modern term. But Klal Yisrael becomes enriched with all of these different kochos. So instead of emphasizing the blinding conformity of saints, we try to look at everybody as an individual. This is the goal of a Rebbe and a teacher. This is the goal of a parent. And even in marriage generally. Husband and wife. The whole idea of why I could, in fact, one of the arguments, obviously there are stronger arguments, but one of the arguments against the legitimation of same-sex marriage, again, this is just one argument, this is not the main thing, is that God specifically wanted the differing viewpoints of men and women who see the world so differently and in opposite ways to come together, that through different perspectives on reality, a wholeness emerges that is greater than the sum of the parts. And you would not have that in a same-sex situation, which just kind of replicates or doubles what you already have. It is precisely the differences. In fact, this is the famous word of the Sfas Emes. When the Torah says a wife is ezer, a helpmate, kenegdo, to be opposite him. So the Gemara asks right away, that's a contradiction. Ezer means to help, kenegdo means to be opposite. So the Gemara's answer is very pragmatic. If you're fortunate, it'll be Ezer. If you're not fortunate, we can have some get that and some get that. But the Sfas Emes gives a different explanation. He says the help that one spouse gives to the other spouse is precisely the fact that men and women see the world in different ways. If I simply married a clone of myself, what would the challenge be? In other words, I would always be right. That's whatever I say is right, because the person would agree with me. I assume that's the way cloning would work. Who knows exactly. But how do you grow? You grow from what you might call loving opposition. Again, loving, supportive, 100%. If people are simply fighting all the time, that's not a marriage. But within a context of love and respect, we grow when we're challenged, and we look at things in different ways. When each one fosters their individuality, and then they're able to contribute to life in a way that they wouldn't if everything would just be this conformity and this sameness. Yeah.
It's very beautiful what you said. I just have to ask, did any of the Parsha address why the counting was only with males?
Yeah, that is a good question. Now, the simple answer.
Could you just repeat the question?
Yeah, the question was, we're talking about unity and community, and obviously women are a vital part of the community. So why is all of the census only of men, and women are not included in the counting? That is a very excellent question. I'm not sure I have a 100% answer for this, but one simple answer is that you'll see that every time the Jews are counted, it's always defined as litzvot tzava, those who serve in the army. In some ways, the census was a counting of those who were eligible for military participation, because in the Midbar, we did have armies at various points, and when we enter Eretz Yisrael, we will need an army. And then we go back to the idea, because I'm not sure if you'll ask on that military service was an activity that was considered to be limited to men, meaning in a Jewish religious army, women would not serve in the army. Now again, I know you might question that as well, but all I'm saying is, if it's an exclusion from military service, that's a very, very different thing than an exclusion from being part of the spiritual nature of the community. Yeah.
Couldn't Ishto Kegufo be an answer?
That might be an answer as well, although once again, that would assume maybe there were no single women of 20 or not. Which I guess is actually reasonable. People got married young in those years, so it could be that any woman that was 20 would already have been married, and then we treat them as units. Seen in that way, Rabbi Poston is suggesting that maybe when we say there were 603,000 men, we don't really mean men. And in fact, the Torah doesn't use the word men, but it means there were 603,000 family units defined as husband and wife. That might be a way of analyzing it, because indeed, it does not say specifically. It says men were counted, meaning men were the ones who gave the money, but they were counted as a family unit consisting of husband and wife. That might be a possibility. Yeah.
This doesn't feel consistent with the second counting, which is celebrating diversity.
I understand. I understand that. But once again, you see, you're trying to do two things at once, which are a bit contradictory, but you need both. And that is, our celebration of diversity is when you then come together and you form cohesive units. Meaning to say, it is not a diversity like multiculturalism, which tears a nation apart. It's a diversity that then has people come together, like marriage. In other words, marriage is not supposed to be the obliteration of the separate identity of a man and a woman, but rather they come together so that each contributes something to a cohesive unit. So you're kind of trying to do both at the same time. So that's why we have the family unit measure. But again, I understand that this does not answer all issues, and that's why in the Torah we read it again and again and again, because there will always be additional perspectives. But the reason why I wanted to bring it up is because, this issue of conformity within a Torah world is a very difficult issue. It is difficult because on one hand we have to be honest. Religious life requires a certain degree, and indeed a high degree of conformity. We believe in keeping Shabbos. We believe in keeping kosher. We believe in keeping mitzvot. Right? We can't just say, everything is equally fine. On the other hand, we have to find a way to create and to legitimate and celebrate differences within that framework of common value, and that's going to be a challenge. That is going to be a challenge, and how we navigate it, I guess we'll navigate it with greater or lesser degrees of success. But it is a major challenge, I think, certainly that Israel faces. The United States, Jews in America face it as well. But I think to some degree, there's plenty of failures and plenty of successes in both places. But in some way, I think the United States developed a religious culture that acknowledged a greater diversity of ways to be a religious Jew than perhaps at least Israeli Torah society has developed. And one of the benefits to Israel of Western Aliyah, obviously when we talk about why should an American or a Brit come to Eretz Israel, so we normally focus on what that person will get from living in Israel. But the truth of the matter is, the Western Aliyah is not only what the person gets from Eretz Israel. I think there's a lot that the person gives to Eretz Israel in a very, very positive way. So one who makes Aliyah can actually, obviously every individual is only a small part of it, but actually in the long run can contribute significantly to a more tolerant, gentle, accepting society, which I think by and large would be a positive thing. Because one of the things I noticed, again, I've only been here for 7 years, is, and again, I don't know if it's a Torah thing or it's just a Middle East psychology. I mean, nothing to do with even Judaism, just the psychology of the Middle East, is there's never a sense in any type of dispute, in any type of discussion, there is never a sense of seeing any legitimacy in the other position. If we're having a discussion or a debate, and you might say a point that I disagree with, almost instinctively, I would say something like, and I think most of you would say, well, I see your point, but consider this. That's how you talk. That's not how things are, your point is stupid, you're wrong. And what happens is, I say that to you, and you say that to me. And you never go anywhere. You're told you're an idiot, and then you feel I'm an idiot, and that's the discussion. So thus, when there was an organization, I'm not sure if they're still around, it was called Common Denominator. So I once saw their debate rules. It said something like, no chairs can be thrown, no furniture turned over. They had to have rules saying that. Now, here is the problem with that. Number one, it's closed-mindedness. It's not allowing yourself to be enriched by the understandings of others. And what does Pirkei Avot say? Ezehu chacham halomed mikol adam. But number two, there's a beautiful verse, again in Mishlei, a very, very famous verse. Kamayim hapanim el panim, kain lev ha'adam li'adam. As water reflects the face that you show it, so too the heart of one person reflects what you show it. Now again, the Vilna Gaon says, if I look at a pool of water, what will be reflected back to me is the face that I show it. I show it a smiling face, I will get back a smiling face, my face. I show it a frowning, angry face, I will get back an angry face. As water reflects what you show the water, the heart of a human being reflects back what you show that human being. I show another human being disdain, dismissal, You're insignificant. Your point of view is worthless. That's a self-defeating proposition. You're not going to convince him. The other way around, he will reflect back to you the exact same negative feeling. You show a person respect, you show a person some type of legitimation, they will feel that towards you. So, in truth, if you just wanted to make your point and be convincing, part of the key is to have respect for what the other person is saying, and then they will understand you. I think this could actually be an enormously important key in religious secular. Instead of one side calling the other side Amalek, and the other side calling the religious side parasites. That's kind of the level of discussion here. If one would understand where each side is coming from and view them with respect, we would understand that Eretz Yisrael needs, number one, people who learn Torah and serve Hashem, and number two, people who are risking their lives for military service. And both of them are necessary parts of how we protect the Jewish people. And each side sees the good in the other, and each side sees the value in the other. And then we can work on compromise because we're on the same team. We have the same long-term goal, the same desire. And that could change the picture of everything. You know, I think to myself, just stand here, maybe it's a little off topic, but you know, I was 2 years ago when there was a very big mass rally against the conscription of yeshiva students. And Baruch Hashem, it was a peaceful rally. It was fine as far as it went. Praying to Hashem that people should be able to learn Torah. I'm not going to enter into the particulars of the debate. But I thought to myself, what would have been if at the end of a rally which talked about the primacy of Torah learning and the need to have people learn Torah, and the fact that that is how, one of the ways that Israel is protected, there also would have been a prayer for the Chayolim, to recognize that we are arguing for the primacy of Torah learning, but we recognize and appreciate the sacrifice of the soldiers who risk their lives every day. Well, I personally think Mashiach would have come literally. I think that would have broken the last part of Golas. But even if Mashiach wouldn't have come, Chas v'Shalom, I think that would have created a totally different understanding of this difficult issue. And I think all sorts of compromises would have been opened. All sorts of avenues would have been opened. And things would have happened that one would not even imagine today might happen. And it's not me saying this. This is Shlomo HaMelech. Kemayim hapanim el panim, kein lev ha'adam liyadam. And this comes by allowing people to develop as individuals. So their inner light comes out and their perspectives come out. And all of these different perspectives enrich our understanding of life, creating a garden of many flowers instead of simply having more of the same. So what's interesting is that even in the most technical parts of the Torah, like countings, right? Who spends time on countings or census? You can actually see some very, very significant spiritual lessons. So anyway, we wish you all have a very, very good week, and we'll see you next time.